covered under the Kyoto Protocol, and how these things and why these aspects should be included.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee, and thank you all. It's quite an honor to be able to present this morning. I'm going to talk about forestry and the role that it plays in the global carbon cycle and why it's really important to have forestry be a part of the regime that replaces Kyoto. So first of all, I just want to talk about how does forestry play into the greenhouse gas emissions. So about 18% of annual greenhouse gas emissions come from what they call LUCF, which is land use change and forestry. Now the majority of that really comes from tropical deforestation. And if you can imagine, if the sea level were to rise 1 meter, about 20 centimeters of that would come directly from deforestation. If you can understand what I'm saying there. And if you can kind of hold that in the back of your head while I talk about this, I think that's a really important piece. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the carbon cycle. If you look over here, we have, this is the global carbon cycle, and a lot of what we think about with the CDM and a lot of is all focused on industry, which is of course really important, but it is not the whole picture of the carbon cycle. Forests and oceans play a huge part of the carbon cycle. And if you look over here, this is a nice forest, and this arrow is coming down. That is carbon dioxide that's being sequestered. It's a sink of carbon dioxide into the ecosystem. But if you look over here, we have deforestation, and there's some fires and agriculture, and this releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's what we call a source of emissions. And so, just to recap, it's really important to understand the difference between these two ideas, that deforestation is a source of emissions, but forests also serve as a sink of carbon dioxide. And for us to really be able to tackle climate change, we have to work with both of these abilities and factors of forestry. So, as Chris spoke about earlier, the clean development mechanism, it does allow for some forestry activities. It allows for reforestation and afforestation. Those are tackling the idea of carbon sinks, so that we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's no provisions to talk about the issues of sources, of preventing deforestation, and there's only 3 certified projects in the CDM market of these types. That's very little, and it in no way reflects the large 18% that forestry contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So where are these emissions coming from? If we look at developed countries, these top 3 non-blue colors, those are industrial gases, and the rest are from fossil fuels. But what we're really looking at here is this part of the pie graph, which is the LUCF, land use change and forestry, which again is mostly tropical deforestation. And if you look, there's none of that in the developed countries. So that 18% really is split between developing and least developed countries. Some countries like Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, over 90% of their emissions come from deforestation. So if we're talking about deep cuts and we want to reach that 350 parts per million stabilization level, then we have to engage forests. And we really need to engage all sources of emissions and all countries that emit. And it's also important that we don't just look at carbon sinks, which are what we talk about now, but we also look at the sources, as I was saying. And there's been a lot of concerns about REDD, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. There's been a lot of controversy, and I just want to kind of demystify some of these ideas. One idea is that if REDD were to be part of a carbon market, that it might flood the market with cheap credits, and that is not true. In fact, including REDD into the market would actually give us a more stringent emissions target that would increase the demand for credits. Another myth about REDD is that it's too complicated, that the science is not there, and that is also not true. I'm from the School of Forestry, and I study this, and I can tell you that scientists know how to monitor and they know how to quantify carbon, and it's not too complicated. And another big myth is that this would only benefit countries that have forests. And so many of you who might come from countries that don't have forests might be feeling this way. That's not true. And that, like I said earlier, climate change is a global issue, and no matter where you are on Earth, you will be affected. And that 18% is a huge chunk of our emissions, and we have to deal with it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliot. Now you can see the studies group